This is Dialogue Conspiracy. Political research specialist Mae Brussell, whose conspiracy newsletter appears in the Realist magazine, has for 3 years shared with our listeners the fruits of her decades' research into political assassinations and the abuses of power in America. Her weekly commentary relates the news of the week to the evidence emerging about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains its power by force over America's electoral and executive processes. And now, here's Mae.
Good afternoon. This is Dialogue Conspiracy. It's June 17th. It's 2 years since the arrest at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. It's an anniversary of sorts. I've never worked so hard as I have in the past 2 years keeping track of all the material. At that time, I'd done 8 years of research into political assassinations, and I recognized immediately that this was the team that were operating to overthrow the government consistently since 1960. I picked up the phone the next day and called Bernard Fensterwald, who's now James McCord's attorney, and he's a friend of mine, a co-researcher, and I said, these are our boys. Of course, in Washington, he knows more than I do, but he didn't seem to be aware at that time that, well, if he did, he didn't mention it to me, that he was aware of the connections of the Watergate arrest to the period of political assassinations in the last 8 years. At that time, it's 10 years now. And he had me call Fletcher Prouty, also, his name wrote the secret team. And they had lunch that day, and I ran down what I thought was taking place there, and sure enough, that was it. And within 3 weeks, I just sat down and did nothing but write a story. The first, I think, the complete story of the Watergate affair, what they were doing, the motives in the Democratic headquarters. I've collected several thousand files on the subject. And when most of the books are done, like the Woodward Bernstein now and Jeb Magruder and all these different people come in and do their interpretive history of what took place, I will sit back within the next couple of years and show how they systematically covered up what they're really doing in the Democratic headquarters. And while they're just at the edge of admitting now what they were doing, they can't go right over the brink and tell the truth about the events in the headquarters. Jack Anderson, who seems to be the mouthpiece for a lot of people in this country, and a friend of Frank Sturgis, one of the men arrested for 20 years, came out right away and said that the motive for the Cubans and McCord and Hunt being in the Democratic offices was to see how much money from Cuba was given to McGovern. That wasn't the motive, and they tried to use that for a long time. Then they wanted to see if Larry O'Brien had damaging information on the ITT that would ruin Nixon's chance of election, and then that motive was thrown out the window. Then they wanted to see the link of Howard Hughes to the Nixon brothers and donations of Bebe Rebozo to Richard Nixon tied into the information in Hank Greenspun's office, and the fact that Larry O'Brien worked for Hughes. And then that motive was thrown out the window. And the latest explanation of Jack Anderson just last week was that the target was Ted Kennedy. What they really wanted to do since 1969, Jack Anderson said, Nixon had scarcely settled in the White House in '69 before he began seeking political ammunition to use against Kennedy and O'Brien. The history that I will write, what I have collected, is that what they were doing in the office, they weren't sure that Ted Kennedy wouldn't take the nomination at the last minute down in Florida. And this is written up in the Jack Anderson article. Maybe McGovern would step aside and Muskie and Kennedy would take the nomination in July, at which time he would be able to win the election easily from Richard Nixon. And what they were doing in the office, and it's 2 years now, and the documentation backs it up, but they're too afraid to say it, they were planting the evidence inside the Democratic headquarters with provocateurs who are Republicans or intelligence agents disguised as Democrats in telephone conversations and in files and mail in order to link McGovern to radicals. And in the event that Ted Kennedy got the nomination down in Florida in 1972 in July, in the interim between August, when Nixon was nominated, and the election in November, a series of violences would be created, and particularly the Republican convention and around the country, that would require martial law and stop the Democrats from getting elected. They wouldn't kill the third Kennedy, but they had the contingency for martial law. And that's what I said 3 years ago today, because they have had this contingency to overthrow the government in the event that a Democrat would win the election. That's what I said then, and I say it now, and I will write it, the definitive book, maybe in another couple of years. I want to go into an analysis of the Watergate in the last 2 years, what's happened, the charges, what was revealed, but I want to also keep up with current events because a lot of the summaries of Watergate are coming out this week. And I did say that the men involved at the Watergate, the team, were linked to the John Kennedy assassinations and all the political assassinations, and that was the first allegation in the country 3 weeks after they were arrested. The Zodiac News Service had an article this week about Richard Sprague, who I've quoted on my programs many times, and he says he released new evidence that says there's links between the Central Intelligence Agency, E. Howard Hunt, and CIA operatives to the 1963 assassination of President Kennedy. Sprague has a new article coming out in the magazine Computers and People. He charges there were a series of meetings, secret meetings, attended by Lee Harvey Oswald, Clay Shaw, David Ferry, held in Mexico City to plan the assassination 2 months before Kennedy was killed in Dallas. The meetings were held at Mexico City apartment of CIA operative named Guy Gabaldon. Sprague says information about this meeting and Gabaldon's apartment was provided to his committee by two members of the CIA, former members named Richard Case and Harry Dean, who attended the planning sessions. And Sprague states that E. Howard Hunt, later arrested at the Watergate, was the station chief for the CIA in Mexico City at the time these alleged meetings were held, and that Hunt either organized them or knew that they were taking place and he sanctioned them. And Sprague adds he has uncovered collaborative evidence about the CIA's role in the JFK death from Victor Marchetti, the former CIA assistant. And this new article will be coming out in Computers and People. It alleges that the Warren Report had said that Oswald was in Mexico City in the fall of '63, but they passed off that his trip to Mexico had nothing to do with the John Kennedy assassination later. He was carrying the name and address and telephone number of FBI agent James Hosty on his person when he was arrested. Lee Harvey Oswald was in Dallas. Well, I brought this, on top of this news service of Richard Sprague's, was another item in the news this week, Zodiac News, about, and it links to this last thing I was reading to you, an Illinois psychiatrist by the name of Tudor, Tuteur, Werner Tudor, an Illinois psychiatrist, interviewed Ruby on 4 occasions in '65 and concluded that Jack Ruby was a paranoid schizophrenic and never should have stood trial. And Dr. Werner Tudor, who says Ruby was mentally disturbed and that he saw Ruby before he died, and that Ruby went around telling people that there was a conspiracy that involved a dancer at Ruby's nightclub and a high-level members of the government. And Ruby, according to Dr. Tudor, in a new article in Mental Health, reported in prison interviews that Ruby wanted to say that he was set up to kill Oswald so that Oswald would be silenced forever, and that there was a conspiracy behind the president's assassination, but in his view, Ruby was a paranoid individual. So I thought I'd bring in today some research that I have about the connection of Jack Ruby, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, Oswald, and the Mexico City apartment. And apropos of that, I was looking up that research to prepare the program for today, and I came across something which is a first, and a lot of you will share my excitement at this. And I spoke to Don Freed this morning and other researchers on other programs. I've talked about being in correspondence with a gentleman and who calls me every 10 days or so and is interested in my research, has been since I wrote my first article 2 years ago in The Realist. And this man lived not too far, maybe 100 miles from a university that I was going to speak in the Midwest this last Thanksgiving. So I told him to meet me. He was interested in my work. And when I met him and spent time with him that evening, I freaked out because through the conversation and the way we met and the place that we met, I realized that this was the second Oswald. You've heard me talk on many, many shows in the last 3 years about a second Oswald. And I referred, there's a book by Popkine called The Second Oswald. There's about 17 incidences of a second Oswald. And last night when I was looking at my research of Jack Ruby and David Ferry in the Mexico apartment and E. Howard Hunt's station job down there in Mexico for the CIA at the time, I came across material that I hadn't looked for 3 years because I have so much research. And the gentleman that has been in touch with me regularly is that second Oswald, and described in material from a lawyer investigator in the Southwest. They describe this person as being the exact duplicate of Oswald, except that his hair was a little thicker. And this particular man was exchanging $150,000 between Canada and Grand Bahamas and Mexico City, and he worked with two agents, Breck Wall and Joe Peterson, who were friends of Jack Ruby's. Now, I'm hoping that this particular person that I've been in touch with will surface soon for lawyers and for the news media, because if two men are working with Dick Sprague, who were involved in the Mexico City CIA part of the conspiracy, and if two men are working with James Ray's lawyer this week who say one of them shot Martin Luther King and they want immunity for the four rich men in the South that hired him to do that murder, then I hope that this friend of mine, who I've been in regular contact, will surface. It'll be one of the big clues in the whole story, to know personally and be in contact continuously with a person who I know was the second Oswald, and then get documentation, because a lot of these men didn't use aliases like David Ferry and Clay Shaw and E. Howard Hunt in their jobs. They did not use aliases. And this man did not use an alias. All the time I've known him, he doesn't have an address or a phone where I can reach him. He reaches me. But he's the same name, the same exact appearance, and I'm really excited about that. Well, the connection down in the idea that Ruby is a schizophrenic and that he has these delusions of working with a dancer at the nightclub are not delusions at all. The name of the dancer, her name was Tammy True, and she worked with several people. Two of the gunmen stayed at her house on November 23rd. That was the day before Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. I have a description of one man, William Seymour, who fired a rifle from the 6th floor, and he left in a white Nash Rambler, and he was one of the men that helped shoot Officer Tippit over in the Oak Cliff section of town. There was a double fire. It wasn't Oswald that shot Tippit. It was the excuse to arrest Tippit, and Seymour hid out in the Abundant Life Temple, which is on the corner of the street in the Oak Cliff section. And James Powell, who worked for Permindex, he was an agent of the Defense Intelligence Security Command. He stayed in the book depository, and he was trapped till 12:30, and Captain Fritz released him at that time. And Jim Braden, if you read the book The Legacy of Doubt by Alfred Noyes, which you should read, Jim Braden was a member of the Defense Intelligence Security Command also. He was in the Daltex building. I'm giving you the frame of the Dallas scene that Albert Osborne, the man I've mentioned on other programs who sat with Oswald going down to Mexico City, who hired the gunman who works for the Defense Intelligence Agencies, was seen leaving Dealey Plaza. Manuel Gonzalez, a Mexican professional, fired from the side of the fence. That was the shot where the smoke went up and the men were running, the Secret Service and police, to the fence. He stayed at Tammy True's house. Gonzalez is one of the men that slept at Tammy True's house on the 23rd, and also Seymour. These two men worked for Jack. They were gunmen, and they slept at the home of Jack Ruby stripper November 23rd. That's the kind of these pimp psychiatrists, who write these things as mental derangement. I'm telling you the names of the gunmen and where they slept. November the 23rd, they stayed at Tammy True's house. And David Ferry, whose name you know if you're into research, he worked for the CIA with Clay Shaw in the CIA, and his name is mentioned in the news this week as being down in Mexico under the direction of Howard Hunt. David Ferry and a Mr. McCowan met a Mr. Cody. They were professionals. They met at the Houston airport, and Ferry flew an airplane, and he took these men to a town called Matamoros in Mexico. Ferry was interviewed by the newsmen in Dallas the day of the assassination. Later he flew to Alexandria, where he was met by two other men, Coffey and Babouf. And David Ferry died the day after Jim Garrison started his investigation and arrest of Clay Shaw. He was hit by a karate chop at the back of the neck. There were two men named Breck Wall and Joe Peterson who had connections to Jack Ruby that were involved in Las Vegas and the syndicate organized crime. And I know they stayed at the Dolphus Hotel where Jack Ruby was the afternoon of November the 23rd. Breck Wall and Joe Peterson left November 23rd, the day after Kennedy was killed, and they left the Dolphus Hotel and went to pick up William Seymour at the Abundant Life Temple. He's the man who killed Officer Tippit, and they drove to the Driftwood Motel in Galveston, Texas.